Good evening. Hope you're all doing well. Today we are on Ayin Gimel Amud Beis, about a third of the way down at Amar of Yitzchak. And Yirtzeh Hashem will make it about two-thirds of the way down on Ayin Dal Amud Beis. And then we are pretty much caught up. Here we go. Ayin Gimel Amud Beis says the Gemara, Amar of Yitzchak bar Yosef, Amar of Yochanan, that Hakol Modim to two pieces of information. Now, before we dig into these pieces of information, let's remember what topic we're talking about, which is Aver Hamiduldal. This is a limb that is barely attached to the body. Imagine a limb that is only attached by skin, and the bones that are in there are just kind of floating. It's not a good matzah. So if you have a piece of a limb like that that's barely connected, so then Rav Yochanan seems to say that two things are pashut. Number one is shemisa. If that animal with the Aver Meduldal dies, then the Aver Meduldal is osen nipol. It's as though it's detached. And if, in fact, it's detached, then it has a din of Aver minachai, because it was alive. If by misa it was as though it was attached, then it was Aver minachai before it died. The limb is viewed as detached. And the second thing that, according to Rabbi Yochanan, is Hakol Modim, is that ve'ein shchita osen nipol, that if you have an appendage that's just kind of hanging on by a thread, but instead of it dying of natural causes and it becoming an Aver minachai, here you shecht it. So then the halacha is that it is osen nipol. Ve'ein shchita osen nipol, excuse me, that if you do shchita, it is not viewed as detached. So what does that mean? When the animal dies of natural causes, we assume it's detached and Aver minachai. When shchita is done and we don't view the Aver Hamaduldal as detached, that means that it moves down from the level of nevela to non-nevela, still not kosher to eat, but at least it's not metame. So says the Gemara, b'maya skinan. What was the case? I mean, I foreshadowed a little bit that we were talking about the Aver Hamaduldal, but the Gemara is going to go through the rigmarole to figure it out. B'maya skinan. What was Rav Yochanan dealing with? Ilema be'ever de ubar. If you think we're talking about a case where a limb was protruding from the birth canal. So that can't be because miflag pligi. That can't be Rav Yochanan's din of Hakol Modim, because that's not Hakol Modim. That's a machlokas between Rav Meir and the Chachamim. So Ella must be the Aver de Behema. We're talking about a limb of an animal that's meduldal. And therefore, Rav Yochanan teaches us these two dinim. It's the same Aver HaMeduldal. Let's just give the same case scenario. Betsy, the cow, has a bad front left leg, hanging on by a thread. If we were to let the animal die of natural causes, that limb is Aver Minachai. If we were to shecht it, it would not be Aver Minachai. What's the difference? Tuma. Because Aver Minachai is Tamei like a Nevela, and Aver, and when there's Shchita, it's not Aver Minachai. Says the Gemara, okay, look, I hear you, Rav Yochanan. There's only one problem, and it's quite significant. Misa Tanina and Shchita Tanina. Both of the rules that you just taught us about an Aver Hamiduldal, where there is Misa, that the limb is Aver Minachai, and the din of Shchita, that if an animal with an Aver Hamiduldal is shechted, that it would reduce, the shechita would not be aver, would make it that the limb is not aver minachai, but rather it lowers its status from nevela down to non-nevela. That also is tanina, and both of them actually come from the same Mishnah later on in this Masechta in about 40, 50 blot. So it says the Gemara like this: Misa tanina, what did we learn? Mesa habehema habasar tzarach hechsher. If the animal dies on its own, then the meat of the animal, the regular meat of the animal, the basic flesh of the animal, will only become tameh with a hechsher if there is one of the seven liquids that transfers tuma. However, and this is our line, v'ha'ever, if there is a limb that is meduldal, mitame mishum ever minachai. Here we see the din of Rav Yochanan, but in Tana, in a Mishnah later on in Maseches Chullin, and continues the brisa, ve'einu mitame mishum ever min nevela. There is a difference between Aver Minachai and Aver Min Hanavela. Those are different tumas. Rashi deals with this, Divrei Reb Meir, and that is source number one that questions Rav Yochanan. Rav Yochanan wanted to say that Divrei Hakol Everyone agrees that if an animal dies when it has an Aver Hamidul Dal, that will be Aver Minachai. Asks the Gemara, Tanina, we already learned that, as you can see over here, that Aver Matame Mishum Aver Minachai. And Shchita Nami Tanina. The second half of Rav Yochanan's din is also subject to question. I don't need Rav Yochanan to teach it to me. I have it in a Mishnah later on Kuf Chav Zayin. What does it say later on about Shchita? Nishchita behema hochsheru b'dameha divrei Reb Meir. That what do we see from the din of Reb Meir? That if you shecht it, then hochsheru b'dameha, then it will be subject to tuma when there is blood. Reb Shimon Omer lo hochsheru. So we see by shchita that it lowers the status. It can even get tameh by something else. What does that mean? If it can get tameh, that it's not tameh right now. We therefore see that shchita lowers the tuma status from nevela to non-nevela because it's not subject to tuma unless there's hukshar. Rav Shimon Omer lo hukshar. We're not dealing with his shita, but nevertheless, our double question on Rav Yochanan is in perfect shape. Rav Yochanan wanted to say that if there's an aver meduldal and it dies of natural causes, that the aver meduldal is aver minachai. And if that same animal that had an Aver Hamiduldal was nishchat, then it would reduce the status of the Aver Hamiduldal from Tameh to not Tameh. And yet the problem is we see that both in the Mishnah on Daf Kuf Chav Zayin, here in this very Masechta. Says the Gemara, no. Ime hahi, if I had only learned from the Mishnah on Kuf Chav Zayin, Havamina mai hochsharu, when the Mishnah said hochsharu, that was only abasar on the regular meat. But it wasn't perhaps talking about the Aver Hamiduldal. It's only talking about one thing. Says the Gemara, look, this is basic grammar from second grade. Hochsharu is not a singular word. It's a plural word. V'ha hochsharu ktani. How can you tell me that the word hochsharu is only talking about Aver Stam and not the Aver Hamiduldal? Says the Gemara, here's really what's going on. Ma'u detema, I might have thought that there was an incorrect understanding. That chad, one marimakom was lebasar haporesh min behema, for flesh that was separated from the main part of the animal. V'chad lebasar haporesh min ha'ever, and one was talking about flesh that was separated from an aver that's aver min achai. Umay ulmei dehai mihai. What's the difference between these two? So it says the Gemara, 8-9 lines from the bottom of Ayin Gimel Amud Beis as follows. Sal Kadaita Chamin, I might have thought as follows: that agav oviv, that since we know that by Aver Minachai, that flesh that comes off of it has a Tuma Chamura just like its parent, just like the Aver Minachai, Emaloli boy Hechsher. I might have thought that there should be no need for Hechsher for Aver Minachai. Kamash Malon comes along Rav Yochanan to say, yes, we do. So really, we have no problem with the din of Rav Yochanan. It makes perfect sense. It was to teach us a side din about Hechsher Tuma, and therefore it's not a duplicative halacha that's overlapping on the Mishnayos. The Mishnah from Kuf Chav Zayin is teaching what it teaches, and Rav Yochanan is teaching what he teaches. They're not a stira; they're complementary to one another. And the Gemara takes this even a step further. Amar of Yosef, Nakot de Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yosef biyadcha. You should even take the din of Rav Yosef. The din of Rav Yitzchak with you. Who's Rav Yitzchak? It's an interesting quote because if you look back up to where we started from today, Amar Rav Yitzchak bar Yosef, Amar Rav Yochanan. Normally, we don't quote like that. Normally, we quote from the source. We would say Divrei Rav Yochanan. Over here, we don't have that. Rav Yosef said, Nakot de Rav Yitzchak bar Yosef, who then quoted Rav Yochanan. You should agree to what he said. De Rabba bar Barchana koi kavaseh. Rabbi Bar Barchana agreed to the double din that if an animal that had an Aver Hamiduldal died naturally, then it would be Aver Minachai. And if that very same animal that had an Aver Hamiduldal was Nishchat, that it would lower the status from Aver Minachai to not Tameh. To Tanya, how do we know? Ubasar besad trefa lo sochelu. And the word ubasar seems to be a little bit duplicative itself, a little extra. So why do we have the word besadeh? So we see over here, look at the language that's used, is that it's aser. Shchita is aser, but not shchita is tameh. That aligns with the din of Rabbi Yochanan. And on the bottom line of Ayin Gimel Amud Beis, Amar Rabbi Bar Barchana Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Ein bohen ela mitzvahs parush bilvad. This is only talking about a mitzvahs parush. What is this talking about? What's mitzvahs parush? So let's take a look at the top two Rashis on the page. Ein bohen iser lav shall aver minachai. When is it that we have the iser of aver minachai? If an animal dies of natural causes and there's an aver hamiduldal, ela mitzvahs parush. Be'alma. Really, it's just a regular mitzvahs parush. Be'alma midirabbanon. V'kra asmachta be'alma. Alma ein shchita ose nipol. From here, we can see that shchita does not make something totally detached. It's still part of it midoraisa, just at midorabanan. We have a strictness when the animal dies of its own accord that we're then going to say that the aver hamiduldal is an aver minachai, but that's only a din derabanan. Top of Ayin Daled Amud Aleph says the Gemara, Yosef Rav Yosef Kamid Rav Huna. Rav Yosef was standing in front of Rav Huna. V'Yosef Amar, and he taught the following din. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav, Achlo Lozeh, Loke, that there are malkos in this case. That if one ate the Aver Hamiduldal, there would be malkos. That's a big problem. Take a look at Rashi. Achlo lazeh ha'ever hamiduldal. Well, that's a big problem for what we just learned from Rabbi Bar Bar Chana in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, who just said that it's an Isser Derabanan. So Amar lehu me Rabbanan lo tatzisu le. Hachi Amar Rav Yitzchak Bar Shmuel Bar Marta Mishmei Derav. Achlo lazeh eino loke. Rashi, third line. Why eino loke? The mitzvahs parush be'almahu. You can't say that there's malkos in a case of eating an Abraham Meduldal when the animal dies of natural causes. No, there is no malkos in that case. After all, we learned on the very bottom of the page going on to the top of this page that it's only Nisr Derabanan. So Amar Le Rav Huna, Anan Aman Nismoch. Rav Huna, remember the flow of what was sitting here. If you look at the top two lines, that Rav Yosef was sitting in front of Rav Huna. So Rav Huna said, Aman nismoch, who should we rely upon? Ahadrinu Rav Yosef le'ape. Rav Yosef turned his face away. Rashi says, Ahadrinu bekas. Amar le my kushya. He says to Rav Huna, I'm not even sure I understand your question. Ki amre ana. When is it that we say that there are malkos? Rashi here fills in the gaps. That's b'misa de osanipo. However, ki amar ihu, the case that we saw earlier, where Rav was quoted as saying that there's no malkos, that's b'shchita de ena osanipo. So he seems to not really agree with what we saw earlier. He holds that there's a difference between misa and shchita. When guess whose shita that is? That's the shita of Rabbi Yochanan that we saw where we started today. A quarter of the wound, not even a fifth of the way down, 12 lines down, says the Gemara in Ayin Daled Amud Aleph, Amar Rava, Minaha Milsa da Amur Rabbanan, that Misa Osenipol, Shchita Eina Osenipol. Where does Rav Yochanan get his din from? That if an animal with an Aver Hamiduldal dies of natural causes, that the Aver Hamiduldal is Aver Minachai, and that if that very same animal was Nishchat, that it lowers it from Aver Minachai to not being Tameh. Tichsiv. As the pasuk says, "V'chol asher yipol alav mehem b'mosam yitma." What does the word mehem teach us? L'ma'ute mai, ilema l'ma'ute b'chayehem. This pasuk's talking about shratzim. If you want to see that it teaches us that a sheret can't be metame when it's alive, well, that I don't need the word mehem for, because mini v'lasam nafka, only when it's in avela. Ella shma mina, that misa osenipol. It must be talking about when they die. That when they die, the Abraham Meduldal is deemed as attached in Abraham Minachai, and ve'en shchita osenipol. So this is where we get this din of Rav Yochanan from this drasha in the pasuk, that the pasuk of shratzim can't be talking about a living sheretz. It must therefore be talking about one that died. Amar le Rav Ada bar Abba le Rabba. Hold on one second. V'hakra b'shratzim ksiv, as mentioned, this pasuk, you're learning out the din of Misa by the Abraham Meduldal and Shchita by the Abraham Meduldal from a sheretz, but shratzim are unique. What's unique about shratzim? Take a look at Rashi, about 11 lines down. Dibur hamaschal b'shratzim ksiv, to lo shayecha b'hu shchita, v'hechi mema'ete shchita mehai kra. That's apples and oranges. You're going to go outside and shecht a squirrel? No, that's not normal. There's no shechita by an animal that's tummy, as we learned about yesterday. So says the Gemara, how can you bring a Mari Makom to Rabbi Yochanan that shechita is eina ose? What was the language? That ein shechita ose nipol. How can you learn that from shratzim? Harei shratzim don't even have shechita bichlal. So says the Gemara, Amar le, you're right, but im eino inyan l'shratzim. We have some extra words in the pasuk. If these words are not necessary for shratzim, dela b'nei shchita, and who granted they are not shaykh to the world of shchita. then guess what? Tnehu inyan lebehema. Slide it over to behema. So this we see sometimes. Again, it's hard for us to appreciate the im eno inyan lex tnehu lewhy because it assumes that we've exhausted every drasha in category X, which is very hard for us, at least for me, in our learning, because we don't understand how to do one drasha, let alone how to darshan every single tag and every single letter and every single S and every single vav. We don't know how to do these things. But the Gemara does highlight that you're right, it's from Shratzim, but we can still learn out that by Misa there is Nipol and by Shchita there's no Nipol, because Afal Pit that the Pasuk's talking about Shratzim, even though that's true, but at the end of the day, we're not concerned about that because im eno enyan l'shratzim tnehu to behema. The Akati says the Gemara a third of the way down, we still need that pasuk, ke'ein misa lachin mitamin, yuveshin ein mitamin, that when an animal is still moist in its death, that it's mitame, but once an animal dries up to the point that it's, I guess, hard, I don't know what the right, how we define no longer moist, but then they're no longer mitame. In my previous house, a rabbit died under the slide of my house. Now, I only noticed it when it was literally a skeleton, but there was obviously a phase of decay. And I don't think it's one of the Shmona Shratzim, but it is Tameh though. So I guess if it's a Hyrax, it depends what the Pasuk meant when it was talking about the four, whatever. But there are gradations. So don't tell me that the pasuk is im eno inyan la'ex tnehu lawai. I need that pasuk to teach me that if an animal is still moist, it's tameh, but in its death. But once the animal dries out and becomes more leathery, becomes more hard and dried out, then it's not going to be metame. Says the Gemara, good point. I embrace your question, but trey ba mosam ksive. It says the word ba mosam twice. Good. Next. Amar Chizda, machlokes be'ever de ubar chai, the machlokes that we have between Rav Meir and the Chachamim, what is that talking about? That's only talking about be'ever de ubar chai, where it's talking about a limb, where the ubar is alive. Aval be'ever de ubar meis divrei hakol, shchita osen nipol. Everyone agrees that if there's an Aver Hamidul and the ubar is dead, then divrei hakol shchita ose nipol. It's just like a regular nevela at that point. Rabba Omar kemachlokes bazeh kach machlokes bazeh. No, we don't say this. Really, we broaden the machlokes from aver de ubar to also to an aver de ubar chai as well as to aver de ubar mace. Now let's talk about another sugya. We're halfway down on Ayin Daled and Aleph, and we're going to talk about a birth that is really not viable in halacha. We discussed this yesterday and many times before. If an animal is born in the 8th month, we assume that animal is a nefel, that it is not a viable birth, and we assume that the animal will not live. And if you look back in our Mishnah from a couple of blot ago, one of the things that you'll see is that if an animal is ben shmona chai, the Gemara on Ayin Gimel told us that wasn't even a min for shchita. Interesting din. That's not a min that we shecht. That's all. Ke'ilu, it's equivalent to an animal that's tamei, a camel or a pig. There's no shchita by those animals. You can cut them all you want. You're not going to change their status one iota. You might as well go hunting at that point, except that it's star balechayim. It's just, there's nothing to do. Kishem that a chazer, you're not allowed to do shchita. If there's an animal that's ben ches, if it was born in the 8th month of gestation, we assume that animal is not a bar kayama. Says the Gemara, that's not true. That's not true that a ben ches is not even bichlal the min of shchita. Tanya, ben shmona cha yochiach she'af al pi sheyesh b'mino shchita ein shchita metaharta. Look at the language here. Even though that its min does have shchita, according to what we learned yesterday on Ayin Gimel, we learned that when an animal is a ben ches, that it is not shaykh by shchita on the level of the min. It is not an animal that is shaykh to shchita. That's not true according to this price. It is yesh b'mino shchita. It's just that the shchita doesn't help in this case. So we have a stira. So Amar Rav Kahana, yesh b'mino shchita, agav imo. You're right. You're absolutely right. The ben chai, the not the Ben Chai, the Ben Shmona Chai, if there's an ubar that is in its 8th month of pregnancy, it had a Shas HaKosher when the mother was pregnant in the early part or in the earlier part of its life, you could have shechted the mother and you would have had a Ben Pakua. So you're good to go. The Tana Didan, Mina Ime Lo Parich. Our Tana doesn't agree with that. I should say the Brisa doesn't agree with that. Mine di'ime lo parich. What does that mean? Take a look at Rashi halfway down, right to the right, and a drop above where we are. Dibur maschil. Mina di'ime lo parich. Lo chashiva la pircha. Tehol ve'ein bivnei ches shchita. Ein b'mino shchita karina bei. That's adorable what you're doing with the mother. That has nothing to do with what we're talking about. We're talking about the ben Shmona in gestation. Leave it be. And there's nothing to talk about. That's our Gemara from Ayin Gimel. But the Brisa is different. The Brisa says Yesh B'mino. Well, the high Tana departed. According to the Tana who is Gores this question, then Treifa de Shchitasa Mitaharta Minale. According to him, then how does he know that a Treifa can get its status lowered by Shchita? Says the Gemara, Nafkalemi de Rabbi Yehuda Marab. To Amar Rabbi Yehuda Marab, the Amri Labamasnisa Tana. Some say we learn it from Rab. Some say we learned it in a Brisa. Amar Krav Chiyamus min habehema. What does min habehema mean? Mixas behema mitama, umixas behema eino mitama. There are some animals that are tame, and there are some animals that when you shech them, they're not tame. Be'ezozo. What is an animal that when you shech it, it's not tame? Says the Gemara, zo treifa sheshachta. A treifa sheshachta is not mitame, tumas nevela. Next, connected. Boy Ravoshaya. Let's say that a person extended their hand into the uterus, v'shachat ben tes chai mahu, and he did a shchita. This is a very impressive feat. So he puts in one hand and locates where to do shchita. He puts in another hand with a knife and manages to get the knife in and do a shchita mahu. And says the Gemara, this case is tiboy le Reb Meir, v'tiboy le Rabbanon. This is true both of Reb Meir and the Rabbanon. Tiboy le Reb Meir in the following way: Ad kan lo ka'amar Reb Meir ben pakua ta'un shchita hani mili hecha diyatza la'avir ha'olam. When does Reb Meir say that a ben pakua needs to have shchita? That's when it's left the body. However, aval b'mei ima lo sharia lo shchita. But maybe the shchita doesn't help at all on the inside, and it needs its own shchita. O dilma, afilu the rabbanon, even according to the rabbanon, dalet simanim achshabei rachmana. Maybe there's 4 simanim that you can use in order to eat this animal that's a ben tes in utero. You could check the 2 simanim of the mother or the 2 simanim of the fetus. So which one is it? Amar Reb Chananya, let's have a look. Tashma, hareisha nolda treifa min habeten. If there is a treifa that is nolda min habeten, that is born through the stomach wall. Ve'im isa, if you want to say that one can shecht an animal in utero and it would be kosher, mishkachas la shasa kosher, diboy ayel yode v'shachta. Then we could have had a case scenario where the animal would not be treifa mi beten, because I could always reach in and shech the animal. It didn't say that. Amar le Rava, that's not correct. Tani, what should the Mishnah teach? Shenotzra treifa min beten. It was born this way. Umishkachas la bebailas hey raglayim. If an animal is born with 5 legs, there was never one moment of shasa kosher. So we can create a scenario where really none of it was ever mutter. Givaldik. Now we're going to learn a Mishnah at the bottom of Ayin Daled Amud Aleph, and really this is the primary machlokas of Meir and the Chachamim around a ben pakua, as to whether or not we are allowed to eat a ben pakua without shchita. And it's subject to a machlokas Tanaim Rav Meir the Chachamim. Let's get started. The Mishnah says 3 lines from the bottom of Ayin Daled Amud Aleph, Hashochet es habehema umatzava ben shmona chai omes. Let's say that I shecht an animal. And then I look inside, and however I'm able to identify, maybe because the shepherd mated them and knows the timing, and inside there was an animal that was 8 months old, dead or alive. Oh, bente shames, or it was 9 months old and dead. So what's the halacha? Koro, you can just tear the animal open, umotzi es damo, and then you're allowed to eat the animal. All of that is case number 1, seemingly no machlokas. Those cases deal with a ben shmona, which is chai or mace, and a ben tisha that's mace. Now, the one permutation that's missing from that list is matzah ben tisha chai. If when you shech the mother, you then cut open the stomach and you cut open the uterus and you see that there's an animal in there, a fetus that's ben teschai. So that's ta'un shchita. That requires shchita. And v'chayev be'osova espino. Osova espino is a prohibition in the Torah, an isser deoraisa, to shech the mother and its child on the same day. It's a lack of rachmanos. You don't shech the mother and its child on the same day. So says the Gemara that when you have an animal that's pregnant, and the animal is shechted, and inside there is a fetus that is chai, and it's 9 months old. So then the Gemara says, we'll see in a moment, this is Rav Meir, that ta'un shchita, there is no din of ben pakua here, and the animal that is the fetus that has no din of ben pakua is treated regularly as it would be in any other case of osova espino, that lo sishchatu biyom echad, that we're not allowed to shech these two animals on the same day. The Chachamim don't agree. Rav Meir holds stuck that there's no ben pakua. Rav Meir holds that way. The Chachamim omrim shchitas imo mitaharto, that the shchita of the mother is mitaher the animal. So they clearly disagree. Now we're on the top of Ayin Dalet Amud Beis. The Gemara now presents a third shita, one that should pose a question for us because it's quite similar to one of the prior ones. Reb Shimon Shizuri Omer, afilu ben chamei shanim. Even if that animal where the mother was shechted, and this animal was the 9-month-old fetus that was alive in utero, and now it's grown up and it's 5 years old and it's in the field. The choresh basadeh, guess what? No shchita is required. Shchitas imo mitaharto. Rashi, Reb Shimon Shizuri, B'Gemara Parich, Hainu Tanakama. That's the opinion of the Chachamim. We know that Rav Meir doesn't hold the ben pakua, but we know that the Chachamim do hold the ben pakua. So what in the world is the difference between the Chachamim who say that shchitas imo metaharta and this language of Rav Shimon Shizuri? Granted, he gives an example of a 5-year-old who's choresh basadeh, but it's the same thing. It's the same thing as it was with the Chachamim who said that shchitas imo metaharta. We're not going to discuss that tonight, but we will soon. Another case. Kara'a, let's say one tore open the mother, meaning not through shchita, and that's what Rashi says. Kara'a lebehema below shchita. So let's say you just cut open the belly of the animal. Umataba ben teschai. Everyone agrees ta'un shchita. Lefishalo nishchita imo. We haven't lost our bearings, right? If you shecht nobody, then pashut the fetus is not going to be kosher. Even according to the shita that we believe in ben pakua, you got to shech someone. You can't. The death of the mother isn't a matir. It's the shchita of the mother that's a matir. So here, even the chachamim who hold the ben pakua would say it's not a case of ben pakua when you kill the mother without shchita. Okay, Amar Rabbi Lazar, Amar Rabbi Shaya, Lo hilchubo al iske shchita bilvad. We are only lenient to say that, again, according not to Reb Meir, but according to the Chachamim and Rav Shimon Shazuri who say that shchitas imu metaharta, we are only lenient in regards to this one area. L'ma'ute mai, so maybe we would want to say l'ma'ute chelbo v'gido. Maybe we should say that, yes, the shchita is matter the animal by ben pakua, but no, you're not allowed to eat the chelev and you're not allowed to eat the gid hanosha. Skip 5 words because they don't belong here. But that can't be that the exclusion is chelbo v'gida because miflag pligi. There, 7 lines down, ayin dalet base. There, the discussion around the chelev and the gid hanosha was already subject to a different machlokes tanoim later on in the Masechta on Daf Tzadi Beis. So that can't be what's going on over here. Why? What was the Maramakom? Titania, Gid Hanosha, Noig Bishlil, Bechelbo Aser. We do have the Isser of Gid Hanosha, and we do have the Isser of Chelbo Aser Dibi Reb Meir. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Eino Noig Bishlil, Bechelbo Mutter. So again, we see the party line of them. Continuing. That obviously, why does Rav Meir hold that the Gid Hanosha is Noig Bishlil and Chelbo Aser? Because he doesn't believe in Ben Pakua out of the gates. Masha'en Kain, according to the Chachamim who do hold of that, that's why what we're seeing reflected in Rabbi Yehuda's Shita, that no, there's no din of Gid Hanasha by the Shlil, and the Chaylev is mutter. Ramar Rabbi Lazar Rabbi Shai, Machlokes beben teschai, halach Rav Meir l'shitas, Rabbi Yehuda l'shitaso. This brisa from Daf Tzadi Beis is perfectly aligned with the open of our Mishnah from Ayin Daled Amud Aleph, really not the open, but the second case, where there was a classical case of Ben Pakua. So what do we see over here? Don't tell me that it's pasha to you that the Chaylev and the Gid Hanosha, everyone agrees it's Asr. No, it's party lines with Rav Meir and the Chachamim. Ella, maybe what we should say is Chelbo de Gid Miflag Pligi. That already we know is discussed at Tanya. Gid hanoshe mechate tachra b'chol makom shehu v'chotech shmano me'ikaro divi Reb Meir. Everyone agrees that's a machlokes, and really Reb Meir's of the opinion that you chase down the Gid hanoshe even in the Ben Pakua. Rabbi Yehuda Omer gomimo im hashufi, or you just cut to the rounded part of the sciatic nerve. I'm not going to get into the details because that's really not this sugya. So therefore, this first version of Rebbe Lazar, Amar Rebbe Shai at the open of the Gemara doesn't really make sense because he wanted to say L'me'ute chelbo v'gido. That doesn't work. That's not a davar pasha. That's something where there's party lines. Rav Meir, who is machmer to say that there is no ben pakua pasha, he's going to say that there's gid anashen and isra chelik. But according to the Chachamim who are makel on ben pakua, they will say, of course, there isn't gid anashen. The chelik is mutter. So therefore, ela itmar hachi itmar. Here is version number 2 of Rebbe Lazar in the name of Rebbe Shaya. Amar Rebbe Lazar, Amar Rebbe Shaya, lo hilchu bo ela al iske achila bilvad, lemeute rov ovechoresh bo. Oh, so says the Gemara. We have a din of ben pakua. The only time we have a kula by a ben pakua is an achila of the ben pakua. However, the animal is still an animal that's subject to the isser of revia, of sodomy, and v'choreshbo. Oops, lost my place there. In regards to kilayim and b'shor v'chamor, we know that lo sachsom shor b'disho. So you might have thought that when we say that there's a din of ben pakua, that the animal is not even an animal. And perhaps isurim that typikally apply to animals, such as revia, such as lo sachsom shor b'disho, you might have thought that those isurim were not relevant to a ben pakua kamash malan, that they are. Amar Reb Shimon ben Lakish, l'div reham matir brechelvo matir bedamo. According to the one who lets the chaylev be eaten, that is the shita of the chachamim, matir bedamo, he's also allowed to eat the blood. And that would be Rav Meir. But Rav Yochanan Amar, no. Even according to the Chachamim, who say that once a ben pakua is a ben pakua, we no longer have a concern about the chaylev. The chaylev is mutter, expressly said in a brisa a little bit above. But still the Chachamim are going to say that the blood is problematic. Says the Gemara, Eisvei Rav Yochanan the Rav Shimon ben Lakish. Rav Yochanan asks on the Shita of Reb Shimon ben Lakish, who holds that there's a link, that whenever we say chaylev is mutter, dam is mutter, and whenever we say chaylev is aser, dam is aser. So the Gemara says, karo umotzias damo. What are you talking about? We said above that if you are going to eat that ben pakua, guess what you have to do? Drain the blood. Even though the chachamim already hold that you're allowed to eat the chaylev. So no, Reish Lakish, the link that you've made between chaylev being mutter and dam being mutter, it's pashut not true, because dam is always aser. Amar Reb Zera, lomar, about 6-7 lines left, lomar she'ein anush kares. All he means to say is that there is no anush kares in regards to the blood that's inside the ben pakua, because we know from Maseches Zvachim that it's really the first gush of dam, the dam that's zorem, right when there's a shchita, that's the blood that is going to be the dam nefesh. This blood is not that blood, so therefore ein anush kares. Leman ka'amrinan. Who is this going according to? Says the Gemara. This really is only going according to Rabbi Yehuda, who is the one who says that the chaylev is mutter, but you still have to get rid of the dam. So lo yehei ela dama tamsis. Maybe we should say we're talking about the second stage of blood, not the initial arterial push of blood, but once that phase is over, it's still a heavy flow of blood, but it's going to be without the arterial pulsing, the dama tamsis. Titania dama tamsis be'azhara. Rabbi Huda Omer hikares. Oh, hold on 1 second. If we're explaining in the name of Rabbi Huda, so then we have a problem. The problem is Rabbi Yehuda holds that even dama tamsis is bekares. Says the Gemara, Gemara of Yosef, Berei de Rav Salach, Hasid the comment to Rav Papa, Islay the Rabbi Yehuda, dam v'chol hadam. He has a special drasha of the extra word v'chol. Kol echad mechayev a dam hanefesh, mechayev adam hatamtzes. V'chol echad lo mechayev adam hanefesh, lo mechayev adam hatamtzes. So this is how we could understand everything according to Rabbi Yehuda. That once we know you're not going to be chayev on the dam hanefesh, because in this case there is no dam hanefesh, it's not a shchita, you're tearing open the animal, then in this case with the ben pakua, there's also no isser by the dam hatamtzes. We're going to stop right here at Iboyalahu, and Amir Tashem will pick up tomorrow night with another Daf Ayin Hey, wishing you all a beautiful night.